everybody. My name is Katie Sanders, and thank you to Carson and Dr. Krishna for taking us on that global tour. I hope that you'll all join me on a different kind of journey now. I would like to thank Dr. Lamm for her guidance and support for this innovative research method. This is a novel analytic method that I'm exploring for evaluation as part of a CDC evaluation project. So arts-based inquiry is a methodology that can be used to portray personal and intimate subjects in research. I myself am an identity-based researcher, and I wanted a way to really explore my participants' lived experiences and their individual expressions of identity within a community-based project that is really often focused on the collective experience. Arts-based inquiry allows us to blend the aesthetics of poetry, in my case, with science writing, to introduce new ways of knowing, thinking, and being related to lived experience. But I want to add, today I'm going to talk about something more so as a new thing to think with, a way to get researchers to really understand how their assumptions and their own identities interact with the research and evaluation process that can sometimes be obscured by a lens of objectivity. Arts-based methodologies may help researchers explore the social impacts of community-based health promotion interventions rather than relying on objective, positivist, or data-driven methods for evaluation. This can disrupt the boundary between the researcher and the research through an effective approach that actively invites evaluation. The purpose of the study today was to explore the use of poetic transcriptions within a community-based research project in rural Georgia. My two research questions were: one, what can poetic transcriptions illuminate about identity within a community-based project? And two, what methodological insights were gained as a result of using poetic transcription, a really arts-based analysis for evaluation that has traditionally been used as a way to assess through objective quantitative methods. A little bit of context. My role as an evaluation team member on the CDC project is part of a 5-year evaluation plan to assess project outcomes for a Healthier Together Georgia. This is a rural public health initiative for chronic disease prevention focused on increased food access and physical activity opportunities in 5 counties in rural Georgia. The data today that I'll be talking about was collected from semi-structured interviews with members of community coalitions in each county. These coalition members are self-appointed informal and non-formal leaders in the community that are in charge of on-the-ground decision-making in collaboration with Extension. Data was collected between March and June of 2020, and the data analysis method I'll be talking about today is poetic transcription. So poetic analysis can be done several ways. There's one way that I'll talk about today, but in general, it's a mode of artful inquiry that really invites the reader into the affective domain. It helps us as researchers and our readers experience new feelings or understandings about the data with which we interact. It's a shift from a representational, descriptive, and explanatory form of thinking to an ontological way of being, non-representational form of thinking that focuses on the essence of experience as it is experienced rather than the representation of experience. Poetic analysis offers a multidimensional and insightful form of social science writing to engage more diverse audiences. If we diversify the ways that we communicate our research, we can diversify those who are interested in the work that we do. Freeman in 2016 wrote a book called The Modes of Thinking in Qualitative Research, and she describes poetical thinking as a felt experience. The experience of being in the whirlpool of sensuous flow that we are as experiencing beings. Poetic transcription, specifically, makes the staging of data that we do as researchers more explicit. So especially in qualitative research, when we code, we are staging that research in a way to orient it toward our research questions. But in poetic transcription, you can see myself a lot more visibly in these poems that I'm going to share today than you can in something that I've coded. I want to briefly provide a comparison of categorical thinking versus poetical thinking. Categorical thinking is what we do when we code data. It's a way to identify and organize large amounts of transcripts or other textual data, to classify it, to create order from data into categories. We sort this data into groups so that we can explain or describe a phenomenon of interest, and the way that we use these data groups is by comparing and contrasting in an explanatory method. Poetical thinking seeks to move away from this representative and descriptive way of knowing toward a form of expression that helps us understand and relate to the hard-to-reach and felt experiences of participants. It's a form of expression which challenges the imagination, not only for the reader, but for the researcher themselves, to see their own interaction with the data in a different way. It's a bit of a research performance, as I'll show you here in a minute, and it can make the researcher themselves feel a lot more vulnerable. It's a way to understand the aesthetic meaning and the sensuous aesthetic experiences that are in data. Poetic transcription is one method that's frequently used to do poetic analysis. It was originally developed by Lamm in 1997, and she defines it as poem-like compositions from the words of interviewees created with data from a study such as interview transcripts. When we're looking at bridging categorical thinking with poetic thinking, poetical transcription is a really good way to bridge if you already have themes identified in the data with a more artful method, because instead of providing representative quotes, you can provide a poem that more richly exemplifies the theme that you want to discuss. So how do we do it? Well, first, if you have themes that you've identified previously through open and active coding, you can move again from this categorical to a narrative or artful mode of thinking. You start by, okay, here's my theme. What participant really stood out to me the most as exemplifying this theme? Once you select that participant, you then identify direct quotes that confirm those themes while still giving honor to participant voices. You can also use your own reflective notes from the data to recall your own experience, because the interview itself is an interaction. You are as much the context of that interview as the participant is. So you're both highlighting your own context and your own interaction with the data, as well as the voice and experience of the participant. Here's a brief example of how Leslie conducts poetic transcription, and she does it in two ways. You can see on the left-hand side the transcript and the identified quotes that she selected in bold. The first method is just doing a chronological order. So taking all these bolded aspects and putting them in a chronological order and making a poem. The second one offers a bit more artistic license to the researcher. You can take these words out of chronological order. You can change them up a little bit while still using the words of the participants directly. And then this aspect here is where we really see the researcher staging of the data. You're not using your words as a researcher, you're still providing it from the participant's words, but you do have a bit more artistic license. So my results, I selected 3 themes related to identity from a previous pilot study with this data. Those themes were religion, being an outsider, and the relationship between history and place. And here is the fun part. As a researcher, we really like to hide behind our objectivity. We like to hide in our computers doing our research. And I was a little scared to share my poems because that's a vulnerable experience. But when we're engaging with participants, we're also entering into a relationship that can make them vulnerable. So this is a way to kind of share that reciprocal vulnerability. And in this way, I created these poems for my participants because I don't get a lot of direct interaction with them. So as I'm trying to understand who they are in relation to this community-based project, I developed these poems. So for Amelia here, I was struck by the religious aspects of her interview and what identity looked like in the context of the Healthier Together project. From my own experience growing up in the southern U.S., I was able to form the connection between religious Protestant Christian ethic and identity. Amelia provided a portrait of what church and religion means to community members that's really informative for project staff as well. So when I was creating this poetic transcription words like church, preacher, and faith. So if you'll all allow me, I want to share my poem from Roger, one of our interview participants who talked about being an outsider. He says, I'm a relatively recent resident of the community. My wife and I moved here 5 years ago. We're in a way kind of outsiders. We're sort of urban dwellers, have a little bit different background, a kind of cultural makeup different from the general populace around here. I've gotten to know some other people, expand my community, connections within the community, being kind of from the outside world. It just helps to make those connections. I have a hard time knowing what anybody thinks around here. I'm sort of an outlier. And not many people really confide in me. I don't have any close friends that I would consider close. This community is, to me, it's still shrouded in mystery. It's pretty okay as far as what people think, but who's really who? I don't know really what's bubbling under the surface very deeply. Here we can see that Roger's poem demonstrates the difficulty of integrating into rural communities if you have not grown up in that community. The bonds in these communities are often formed in ways foreign to those from more urban or suburban areas like myself. This insularity can present not a barrier, but a challenge to professionals working in these spaces. And it has implications for development and the understanding of a collective community identity. Evaluators are often external to the community coming in, so understanding what this insularity looks like from an arts-based method can help us reconsider the ways that we view entry points into a community. A final poem about history and place is the one of legacy. Don, one of our participants, was a historian, and he punctuated his story of slavery and history related to agriculture with dates. And I was struck by the sterilization of the story through numbers. And so in this poem, I wanted to highlight how that punctuation really limits the way that we can really have conversations about historical conflict that still resonates in many rural Georgia communities today. So some key findings. Arts-based approaches can allow for an exploration of nuance between participants. It helps us understand in a different way those lived experiences that impact development work. If we weren't able to do this poetic analysis, we might not understand fully the richness of what it means to be an outsider, what it means to exist in a community that we're not familiar with, and how we can really take these aesthetic forms of lived experience and challenge our own assumptions as evaluators external to these communities. Coding primarily is a form of aggregation. You lose so much nuance when you do coding that poetic analysis as a comparative method can help revitalize. We often hide behind this veil of objectivity, especially in evaluation research, but these poetic transcriptions help evoke emotions. It can also help us communicate the social impacts of our work, as well as any gaps that we're not targeting in the work that we do. The poetic transcription itself puts the researcher in context with the data. We are in context with that data because data collection is an interaction. And when we try to extricate ourselves from that data interaction, then we can actually find the way that our own identities as researchers are moving and shifting and changing those results that we're interpreting. It's a way that we can also meaningfully communicate lived experience of participants with other people in our projects, to the funding agencies, and to whomever. Some future directions would be using arts-based approaches in the development work that can help researchers and practitioners think through the narratives produced in their work. So often in development work, both domestically and internationally, we bring narratives with us from this Western perspective. But if we aren't forced to reconcile with those Western perspectives and do so in a way that directly brings ourselves in conversation with the narratives that we produce, we risk perpetuating inequalities and structural oppressions present in the community. So I just encourage people to think through how their own identity works with the work that they do, You don't have to create poems. It's quite a vulnerable experience reading these out here for you. But I do encourage you to think about data differently. Think about it as an interaction and understand how the work that you do produces narratives that ripple far beyond yourself. Thank you all for listening. This will be published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. Here's a link to that journal, currently in press, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share it with you all.
Thank you. This is a really unique method of analysis. So can you talk a little bit about why you guys chose, because it sounds like it has to do with the grant that you were working on, but why you guys decided to do this specific methodology?
Sure. I took a class. Okay. Always fun. And I was like, okay, what's the most optimal method that I can do? And because I don't usually have those opportunities to do it, and it's an EC funded project that has pretty strict guidelines or predetermined guidelines for evaluation. So I wrote this paper as part of a qualitative methods course, and I wrote it, and I sat, I was like, I'm not gonna bring this to Dr. Lamm, she's gonna think I'm crazy. So then I brought it to Dr. Lamm. She thought it was mildly crazy, and then she read it. And she said, wow, as someone who's in Athens not able to travel into these communities because of COVID, I feel like I know these participants on a very different level. So it's kind of a complementary part of our evaluation, more for internal communication among the staff, especially those in Athens who aren't in those rural communities. It's not necessarily something that is part of our CDC evaluation, but as I said at the beginning, I'm really just trying to have researchers have some new ways to think about their own interactions with the data. So it's still in an experimental form right now, but I would hope to bring it forward in evaluation.
Questions?
Fantastic presentation. You said that you took a class that led to this paper. Can you describe in particular some of the training that somebody would have to go through, like myself, to be able to conduct research like this? So when I need to take a class, like how would that work?
No. So there's a really interesting article, I have the citation that I can share with you, but it's about doing poetic analysis good enough. And it's not that, I'm not a trained person in English literature. This is my first time writing poetry, hard to share and feel comfortable doing so. And I have that imposter syndrome, like who am I to do this? I'm not these participants, I'm not even in these communities. But I read the Freeman way of thinking, and as we move toward this qualitative method, yes, there are steps that you can take, but there's a lot more liberties that you have, and it's more about not doing the method correctly, but doing the method reflexively. So thinking about your interaction, who you are, how you are making choices in this data, and it's more introspective than it is prescriptive.
Thank you.
So, I know I helped you with the interviews and also coding the data. I was referring to there, but I did not go poetic in our interviews. But I really like this idea. I did not take the class, but I know this was early 2020 when we did this, and it seemed like a really great way to kind of handle burnout at that time. As we all sat in our homes and transcribed interviews and things like that, and worked on our research, it just seems another way to connect with communities when you're so isolated too, and a way to be closer to them, like you mentioned before. And it's really interesting. I mean, I have to think about poetic transcriptions and artful translations of items as a way to handle my own stresses in my job.
Yeah, and I would also highlight that this was just one way to do poetic transcription. This, for me, as an identity researcher, was a way to feel like I could connect a bit more with my participants. Moving forward, I would really love to do a poetic transcription where you provide the transcript to the participant themselves and they make a poem from their own words. So there are many ways that you can go about doing this in a participatory fashion. Due to COVID, this was a way that I felt I could connect more deeply with my participants while being geographically separated.
Did you specifically, like with the poems and their structure, did you follow like a previous like poem structure like haiku or something, or did you just like kind of a pattern?
So I did more of a free verse, whatever was striking me, like you saw in Don's poem process and a creative process for me that ended up being something that resonated with somebody else. But there are ways that you could do more structured poems.